Starting a series on grief. How do you actually grieve? Today, I'm going to talk about the very popular 5 stages of grief by Dr. Kubler Ross. But this is actually day 1 of a series on assessing those different theories, maybe reading some books, and kind of providing live, interactive, how do you actually grieve? So if you don't know me, I'm Dr. Bunda Kumara, psychiatric nurse practitioner with over 20 years of clinical experience, but my real experience comes from my life, and my experience in grief comes from my own loss. I am going into 45 days of grief, grieving the loss of my children. So you can either follow me through that or go back and look at those things. But the first thing I want to talk about is these 5 stages of grief. I mean, we learned this in elementary school. We learned it again in high school. If you took a psychology class in college, you went over this 5 stages of grief. And as I have experienced unimaginable loss in my life, this 5 stages of grief has often kind of actually been a trigger for me. I'm like, that is not how it happens. That is not how it works. And so today I actually took some time to study it. Dr. Kubler Ross, as she was doing her theory, she was working a lot with end-of-life care and hospice care. So people who were going through kind of some anticipatory death, anticipatory loss for those family members. And so those stages make a little more sense in that respect. But what I want to talk about when it comes to the 5 stages of grief, I actually learned something this morning as I studied it from a academic standpoint. We need to acknowledge, as part of the grieving process, we need to acknowledge that all of these things do happen. We have periods of denial. We have periods of anger and anxiety. We have periods of bargaining, which I don't really like the word bargaining because it sounds like you're trying to negotiate with God, which might be true if you're doing some anticipatory grief. But when I studied it, the actual bargaining also has to do with kind of struggling with the why, the purpose. Why did this happen? And also acknowledging that symptoms of depression, depressed mood occurs in grief because that pain is so overwhelming. And the last stage, they talk about acceptance. And I think this is probably, there's 2 reasons why this stages of grief is a trigger for me. One, I don't see it as stages that you work through. Also because the word acceptance does not make sense in unimaginable intense grief like losing a child. And so I have kind of changed that word acceptance to present. Can I be present in the moment? Can I accept that my child is gone and that I will see them again in eternity? Can I accept that my life without them has purpose and meaning? And I get a little choked up even saying those things, and so I'm not there. But could I get there? Could I get to that acceptance of the present moment? I do believe so. So let's talk about the 5 stages of grief and how that manifests in your actual grieving. So denial. This is not denial that it happened. It is denying the feelings or avoiding the pain. And as many of you know, I lost a son in a drowning accident in 2005. I lost my son Reggie in 2016, and I was doing this process of controlled grief, very actively for 5 years. And I was starting to get to the point of presence, and acceptance. And then my daughter died in her sleep just 10 and a half months ago. And I think, I know I have been kind of holding on to that denial piece with her for these last 10 and a half months. And it's not that I deny that it happened. It's not that I haven't taken some time for controlled grief, but the majority of time in the last 10 and a half months has been avoiding that pain. And so that's actually why I chose to go into this 45 days of grief, because I know that for my health, I have to bring that to the surface and begin to feel that pain. I often talk about if you avoid pain, it will come out in other ways. It'll come out in irritability, anger, depression. But just acknowledge that and try to get into feeling the pain. So when I look at what Kubler Ross talks about as the stages of anger, bargaining, and depression, this all kind of enmeshes together for me, and I think for a lot of people. It doesn't really go in stages as it's originally described. This is the pain. This is the feelings, and they come up kind of all together. I mean, I'm angry. I'm angry with God, maybe myself, with the life that I've been given. I am constantly asking why. What is the purpose? How do I make sense of this? And when I'm honestly allowing myself to feel that pain, I feel depressed. And it doesn't necessarily have to be clinical depression, but acknowledging that these three things happen and probably all together. And so as I discuss the 5 stages of grief that we often learn, I would like to put a different spin on that. That denial and avoiding that pain is not healthy. And yes, we want to get to that acceptance and being able to be present in our current situation. But this anger, bargaining, depression, the why, making sense of it all, this is one piece that you have to organize, that you have to lay out and decide how to move forward in these different areas. When I talk about the Mentally Strong method, we talk about think, organize, and choose. And for me, organizing these thoughts are, the why. I don't know that on this side of eternity, I'm going to ever really know why. But I need to cherish, 1, our memories, but 2, the fact that I have had some experiences. I do have a purpose, and trying to reframe those things in a positive and allowing myself to feel the pain of my grief, which I call controlled grief. So when we look at these 5 stages of grief and all of her work over time in this grief theory, that yes, it's hard to understand when you're going through intense grief, but let's not look at it as stages. Let's look at it as acknowledging that all of these things, all of these feelings occur. And let's look at other techniques, other theories and techniques to actually organize those and begin that healing process so that we can get to acceptance. So that's our first video in our grief series of how do you actually grieve. So 5 stages of grief, we're acknowledging that they're not necessarily stages, but they are feelings and emotions that occur in grief. And we will continue to learn how to actually process that and move forward and find purpose and meaning in our current situation. I believe that you are mentally strong and that you can overcome in this journey of grief.